Thank you for joining us today. This is going to be a brief introduction to the healing trauma and support and recovery through the Gestalt model. And I want to start just by covering a few little things. This is the brief introduction to the 6-module program that's going to be starting later this year. So I just want to start it off by just putting together some basic ideas of what we're going to be covering today, knowing that this is just a brief glimpse of what we're going to be covering in the program later. So I always like to start by identifying a couple important things. Hello, welcome. This is a brief introduction for the training on healing trauma and the path of recovery, which is a longer 6-module training that we're going to be providing later this year. And I wanted to do this free online lecture with all of you just to serve as an opportunity to share a little bit of what we are going to be talking about, a little bit of some of the ideas. I want to start by just letting you know a little bit about myself. My name is Rafael Cortina. I'm a Gestalt psychotherapist, and I live in San Diego, California. I am Mexican, grew up in the border between Tijuana and San Diego, which is in the corner of Mexico and the United States. And I've been working for the last 20 plus years and primarily working with trauma and addiction, even though early on it was not as clear as it became later. My path started in working with people in recovery, and it was an interesting calling to walk into that because I remember when I was in school, I always thought that the last thing I wanted to do was work with people in recovery. It just felt like this impossible task to work with addiction. Of course, at that moment, I was referring to substance abuse. As you will see later in this lecture, when I talk about addiction now, it's not exclusive to substance abuse, because that's one of the mistakes that we make in our field, that we assume that whenever we think about addiction, we think about substances. And it's much more than that, right? Addiction, as I will explain a little bit later with more detail, it's any behavior or substance or person or relationship or emotional connection that gets in the way of us being able to be in contact and be present with ourselves. So in that early journey, it felt impossible to be able to work with people who suffer from addictive behaviors. Part of the reason was that in my own history, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of alcoholism. And later on, as I became aware of that, and I saw some of my family members pass away and have health complications and not being able to stop, it really felt like this impossible, daunting task. It was not until a little bit by chance, a little bit by destiny, you know how these things happen, I had ended up working in an outpatient program that was primarily dual diagnosis, primarily substance abuse. And what I discovered in doing this work was that there's a humanity component that is necessary to do this healing and to do this work, that it was beyond the substance abuse. It was beyond the destructive behavior. And I discovered early on that in order to do recovery, we need to do trauma work. It's impossible not to do trauma work when we're trying to help somebody recover from addictive behaviors. And I started doing this work and getting more into understanding trauma work and the relationship between the two. And for me, there was always a very important underlying piece, which is being a Gestalt psychotherapist, a relational Gestalt approach, being able to connect with people on this basic principles of Gestalt: contact, connection, awareness, and the challenges that come when the effort that people make when they experience trauma to disconnect, because in disconnecting is how they feel safe. They're suffering, there's uncomfortableness, but there's an avoiding of painful experiences that leads to a way of adapting that becomes very dysfunctional. So in doing this work, as I continue to evolve in my profession and working with people in different settings, I discovered that the opposite is true. It's impossible to do trauma work without addressing the addictive behaviors. Especially we understand addiction, as I mentioned before, as something beyond just substance abuse. So with that said, I'm going to be sharing some slides along the way. They're going to help us just have some perspective and some visual ideas of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start with sharing with you a little bit of a more why we do this, right? This is a poem by one of my clients that I work with for a long time. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background on who he is so you can understand the words. This is a young man that I started working with me when he was 17. And he lost his father when he was 4 through gang violence. His mother was not in his life because she had issues with mental illness and drug addiction. His next family member that was available to him was his great grandmother, who unfortunately had dementia. And by the time that he was 5 years old, he was in the system. He was removed from his home. He was living in children's homes. And when he was about 8 or 9, he was adopted by this amazing, wonderful, loving woman, which has been part of his life ever since. And when he first came to me, he was abusing marijuana. He was diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, a lot of depression, a lot of suicidality. And through the years of working, he began to write. And in his writing and rapping, he gave us and he gave permission for me to share some of his work, because what he's able to convey with his words, it's the personal experience of what it is to live in the reality of addiction, to live in the reality of pain, to live in this reality of needing to disconnect just to survive. And later on, I'll share another poem of why is it that we do this work, what we're hoping to achieve. So I'm going to read his poem now, and it will help us hopefully get a sense of why this work that we do is so important. Every day I wonder. Every day I wonder if the demon that slumbers in me will arise, filling my head with lies. I have vivid thoughts as well as dreams, watching blood flow and hearing screams. I try to fight this while I ask, why am I like this? I'm acting cheerful while I'm truly fearful. In the darkness, something's lurking, and it's smirking. I wonder, is my medication working? I feel page after page of raw emotion, unrelenting rage, as powerful as a stormy ocean. I go to therapy searching for answers. I hope it's helping me, but my soul is infected as if it has cancer. Is this infection simply a reflection of what I truly am, or another deception? I need medication just to get through the night. I'm hoping I'll see another day and be in the light. Recurring voices. Thankfully, they're not evil, and at times help me make just choices. However, even when medicated, at times I almost implode. I take a wrong turn on the wrong road. For years, when I was dreaming, I was seeing demons. I wake up sweating and screaming, still feeling like something's trying to drag me to hell. So I self-medicated with weed and liquor. It will help for a while, but in the end, I became bitter and sicker. I think that in these words, we truly are able to connect with the painful reality of being in this world and trying to survive through anesthetizing, through disconnecting, in his case with substances, just to be able to keep that pain manageable. And it creates a horrible existence and suffering. So a lot of what we're working with when we embark in this journey is being able to allow ourselves to sit with someone else and begin to make space for pain. Because that's how we heal. We heal through making space for pain. When we run away from pain, we run into suffering. And this is what this poem is showing us: the suffering of being in pain and not being able to have any relief from it, except by stuffing it down through addictive relationships, addictive behaviors. So let's talk a little bit more about addiction. For me, it's important to begin by understanding, when I talk about addiction, right? When we're talking about addiction in this talk and later on in the training, it's not addiction as this disease that is dysfunctional. I truly believe that that addiction is much more than a disease. It's related to a developmental adaptation, right? If we look at most people's stories, and I know I see this, you probably see this in your practice as well. When somebody comes, we'll stick for substance abuse just for this example, and they have a problem with alcohol or substances or drugs, whatever it might be. I have not had a different answer through all the years. When I ask, when did you start? It's anything between as young as 9 years old has been my answers, but it's normally between 12, 13, 14, early adolescence. Sometimes a little bit later, sometimes earlier, but it normally starts in that moment where I'm coming to the world and I'm no longer a child and I'm beginning to relate to others, and I'm more self-aware of myself as a being that's going to be interacting with others and be seen. It is in those moments that all the uncomfortableness, all that pain comes to surface, and I'm not able to connect with others without finding a way of adjusting. I really believe that addiction is a functional creative adjustment in early life. This is really, really important, because a lot of the times what we see of the addictive behaviors is the aftermath, the discontrol, the disarray, the pain, the suffering, the negative consequences, the broken relationships, the broken promises, the inability to function and connect with others. And in that moment, we're seeing the dysfunction of addiction. But before it becomes dysfunctional, there's a moment that it's adaptive. Before it becomes maladaptive, it has to be adaptive. It might be for years, it might be for months, but there's a moment in time where, in order to manage and survive their situation, their moment, their experience, that addictive behavior or substance was the way they survived. So, as I mentioned before, addiction serves the purpose of interrupting contact, with my emotions, sensations, with others, with the world. And it does a good job. But there's multiple ways of doing that beyond substances: gambling, sex, relationships, falling in love, work, etc. One of the most challenging things at times is that we have certain addictive behaviors that are not just socially accepted, but they are celebrated, right? If somebody is a hard worker, they're working 80, 100 hours a week, they're successful, they're providing, they're financially stable, we don't realize that this is an addiction, right? And it is an addiction because if you look at their life, right, outside of their successful work, there is literally nothing different than the experience of an alcoholic, meaning they're disconnected from their family, they're not present, they're tired, they're physically drained, they have physical consequences, they're more short-tempered, they're angrier, they're unable to function, they're fully disconnected from themselves, they don't know how to relate to others, they're only focused on their only purpose and what happens in their mind most of the time, it's not all of the time, is work, success, clients, relationships, deadlines, whatever it might be, which is exactly what happens to an alcoholic, but it's about alcohol, getting it, hiding it, protecting it, making sure that they have it. When is the next time they're going to be able to drink? That obsessive thought that pulls me away from myself as a way of medicating uncomfortableness, pain, sadness, etc., is the same no matter what the compulsive addictive behavior is. The consequences might be different. The way it is experienced might be different, but its purpose at the end of the day is to change the brain chemistry. That is the goal of addiction, to pull us away from experiencing, trigger the dopamine receptors in our brain, and have this flood of feel-good dopamine that goes all over our brain. And in that moment, it makes all the problems, all the challenges, all the discomfort melt away. Because at the end, that's the functional piece of this creative adjustment. In that moment, when my resources to manage my life situation were not possible, I cannot go away, I cannot run away necessarily, I cannot protect myself in a way that I could be self-sufficient. In order to survive that moment in my life, the best thing that I could do is disconnect. Now, in the long term, this becomes dysfunctional, it becomes maladaptive, it becomes something that creates pain and discomfort. And I think it's really important for us to be able to have an understanding of what addiction is. So through the years of reading and exploring, I have gone to a lot of different definitions of addiction, a lot of different understandings, and looking for something that resonates with the Gestalt perspective of the relationship and the ideal and this more functional way of adaptive, of organismic self-regulation. But at the same time, it helps us understand what addiction looks like. And through all those readings, I finally found the closest thing to an answer in Gabor Mate's book, Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which I highly, highly recommend for anybody that's interested in learning more. He's not a Gestalt therapist by trade or by name, but a lot of his work, and he even says this sometimes in his lectures, is highly connected to some of the core ideas and philosophy of Gestalt psychotherapy. Anyway, so let's talk about what is required. What are the components of addiction? And as you listen to this, realize what are all the possibilities, all the different behaviors, situations, emotions, as I mentioned before, gambling, sex, et cetera, that could potentially fit into this description. So number one, the addictive behavior or substance or person or relationship, whatever it might be, it brings craving, relief, pleasure in the short term. What does that mean? It feels good, right? It creates, as I mentioned before, we want to look at what happens in the brain. There's a secretion of dopamine that feels really good, right? It's pleasurable by nature, or relieving of pain by nature. So I still, to this day, after doing this for more than 20 years, I still have not met one person that has become addicted to something that does not feel good. I know, and that feel good might not be for me, but for them it's pleasurable, right? So in order for something to be addictive, the first qualifier is that it needs to bring short-term relief or pleasure. Now, that's one of the components, right? Because there's a lot of things that are pleasurable, that feel really good, but they're not necessarily addiction if the other two components of addiction are not there. So the second component is negative long-term consequences. So whatever that feel-good experience, eventually it starts to have negative consequences in my life. Relationship problems, physical complications, inability to perform or function in the same way that I can. So there's tangible, real negative consequences that, as long as I continue doing this, is having an impact in my life that is affecting me or my loved ones or people around me or the world. So that's the second component. And I mentioned that in order to call something addiction that in nature has become compulsive and destructive, there needs to be three qualifiers. So if something brings me short-term relief and it has negative consequences in the long term, but I'm able to stop, it's not addiction, right? Because this is something that we all experience at times, right? We do this thing that feels really good. It starts to bring negative consequences. And then I'm able to say, I don't want to continue in this path. the consequences are not worth it. That is not addiction, right? That is not a compulsive disruptive behavior. So the final component for us to consider something addiction is the inability or unwillingness to give it up. So it brings me relief, pleasure in the long term, in the short term, sorry. It has negative long-term consequences. And despite those negative consequences, I'm unable or unwilling to stop. This is where addiction at times appears to be so irrational and nonsensical that I'm doing this thing that is hurting me, that is hurting others, but I can't stop. Now, we need to understand that the reason that for a lot of people that can't stop is because it has become a way of surviving. I have had clients that have said this to me: if I stop using heroin, I will die. I know that for us, that sounds like the most illogical sentence, but for them to be able to not be disconnected from their body, to not pull away constantly, it's a bigger threat to make space for the pain, to make space for all those possible realities that I have pushed away for years. That's a worse experience than the negative consequences of substance abuse. I'm willing to trade the misery, the pain, the discomfort, the physical deterioration for that brief moment of bliss, that it makes everything go away. We need to understand how powerful this is, how it is a lot of times linked into being able to survive. Because at the end, what addiction is what some of the warmest blankets that we're ever going to have. It really takes us away and puts us in this very warm, safe cocoon. Later, it comes with all the negative consequences and it slaps you in the face and it's horrible. But for that brief moment, however long it lasts, there is being enveloped and covered and protected. And we need to really understand that, embrace it, and connect with it. If not, we're doing a disservice with the people that we're working with on just telling or acting like this is a bad thing that you just need to stop. Because if it was that easy, right, most of us, as soon as negative consequences come, will not continue something that is hurting me and others. But it is linked to that moment of safety. And it's important to understand that whatever that need is behind the addictive behavior, whatever the need for that blanket, that was never the problem. Needing a blanket was not the problem. The problem sometimes is the blanket that we choose that eventually becomes a series of negative consequences. So in order to better understand this, I'm going to share this brief clip with you. Before I share the clip, I want to give you a little bit of a setup for it. So this is a movie by Denzel that starts Denzel Washington. The movie's called Flight. For any of you that have not seen this movie, I mean, I highly recommend it. It's a great movie, and it really does give us a glimpse of what addiction looks like in a very, within the fact that it's Hollywood in a very real way. So just so you understand the scene that we're about to watch, this man is a pilot that was drinking in flight. He was a pretty significant alcoholic, so he would drink all the time. He's flying the plane while he's drinking, hiding. And then suddenly this thing happens where they had to do this very complicated and emergency maneuver, and he's able to land the plane because he's this amazingly talented pilot. So even though he was intoxicated, he's able to land the plane and save most of the passengers, but not everybody survives. So there's this big investigation that happens in terms of what was going on and so on. And they're finding there's evidence that he might have been drinking. And in order to prepare for this case, he has a support system and lawyers and all this stuff. And he's now sober for 3 months. And he's trying to get his life to get together to avoid severe negative consequences, prison, losing his ability to fly. So there's all this looming negative consequences. So he is in the hotel the day before that biggest day of his life, the trial that's going to determine if he loses his pilot license and potentially goes to prison, or if he's able to walk away. And he's been sober for a few months now. He's alone in his hotel room. And let me play the video so you could see what happens.
How's our man?
Not a peep.
Maybe overslept.
Didn't let any girls in there last night, did you?
No, sir. Not so. No one came in or out besides room service.
You have a key? Hey, Will. Hey, buddy. Will.
Where is he? Where is he? Where is he?
I don't know.
This is an example of how powerful that whole of addiction is, and that whole to disconnect and protect, right? So he has all these things looming, and the discomfort of sitting with that is just too much. And even though it makes no sense, the need to anesthetize and protect takes over. And that brief moment of that pleasure, it feels like it's worth the negative consequences. Of course, this is a movie, right? And this was a real situation. Probably there's no way they would have left all that liquor inside his room. But anyway, beyond the part that is nonsensical about that being a movie, this is the reality of how powerful this need to disconnect is. And if we just looked at this like this deviant behavior, like somebody who's misbehaving, and how is it possible that you could be such a horrible human being, we run the risk of doing the thing that originated the drug abuse or the substance abuse or the addictive behavior, which is to feel that there is something wrong with them, to feel not human, to feel like there's something about me that is so horrible that the worst thing that I could do is be me. That is the complication of addiction. So it's important for us to realize, and this is really, really important. So it's a simple concept, but if you take something away from today, this could be something that could be very valuable, that addiction is not the problem. Addiction is the attempt to solve the problem. So in this case, if we just focus on the fact that this person drank again, and it's hard not to do that. And I'm not saying to ignore it or not talk about it. It needs to be addressed. But what really needs to be understood is, what is it trying to solve? What is the pain behind? What is the situation that is serving? Because addiction serves the purpose of disconnecting. It's a disruptor of contact. It's a disruptor of permanence. It's a way of medicating and managing life. So the addiction, as problematic and disruptive as it is, and that needs to be addressed, without forgetting that it was never the problem. It was only the attempt to solve it. Which leads us to what is behind that? What is it that we're healing? What is the problem? And that's what we call trauma, right? I want to start by just saying a couple things here, where when we talk about trauma, one of the common misunderstandings is that trauma is this big event, this big painful moments that we're able to identify as this is what created this disruption in my life. And that's true sometimes. Sometimes there's abusive behaviors that are so disruptive, or moments or events in our life, catastrophic moments, that we're able to say, yeah, this was a huge deterrent in my life. So the way that I have of explaining this, right? This is actually a sample that I commonly use with clients. If you think about a can, right, like a soda can, I'll use this as an example, and you get a big rock, right? The soda can is a person, is the individual, it's me. And I'm shaped as a soda. And so far, I'm able to function as a coda, as the can is able to function and do its work, right? To hold liquids and whatever. If I take this big rock and I strike the can, it's going to be reshaping. It's going to be different. It's going to affect its functionality. It's going to affect how it looks. So that's what trauma is. It's an impact that changes who I am and how I see the world and how I relate to it. I get reshaped by trauma. That's one of the ways that we get reshaped by trauma. Those bigger rocks that are clearly, you're able to pick up that rock and say, yeah, this is how this dent happened to the can. However, trauma could also come in different ways. So if I take little pebbles and just constantly hit the can with pebbles, eventually that can will be reshaping. But it's impossible to find the one pebble that caused all of that. And that's the other aspect of trauma. They're constant patterns, situations, behaviors, moments, environments that reshape who I am and how I see the world. But they're not easily as clear as the big rock. What are those patterns? A disconnection because parents are not present, depression from a parent, not being able to be held, to be seen because there's so much going on. Constant patterns of possible aggression and up and downs in the emotions, anxious households, fearful households, and so on and so on. And one of the things that we do sometimes that's really unfair is that we measure trauma from an adult perspective to horrible stories that could be about my parents or someone else, and we dismiss the reality and the experience for that child. But the reality is that when you're growing up and you're constantly being hit by those little pebbles, they eventually little mark and have an impact on how I see myself, how I see others, and see the world. I'm going to share one more video with you. And I won't say much about this. I'm just going to let the video do its talking, and hopefully it will help illustrate some of these things that I'm sharing about trauma. So you can see in this pre-film, like, it really does illustrate how this trauma experiences reshape how I see myself and how I see the world. You can see in those different moments the laughter, the music, the noise, the people on the train, they become threatening. They become uncomfortable. It's not just somebody laughing, it's this uncomfortable experience of being around humanity. And you see this reflected in his body and his essence and so we wear trauma. And sometimes when he sees the young lady in her own trauma experience, there's a connection. We're able to find each other in that pain, which creates a possibility for connectiveness in that pain. Sometimes this is referred as a trauma bond, but the risk of that is that it's very fragile, and that with just one brief moment of disruption, they break away and it ends. And I think this is a very illustrative way of showing how fragile the ability to keep ourselves safe is when we're experiencing so much pain and have to be constantly protecting ourselves. Our nervous system has to be on guard, has to keep us safe. So anything that's even a remote possibility of a threat needs to be treated as life-threatening. Survival is key. So I walk away, I run, I hide, I protect. Right. And we see this in all the characters, and the older man who's observing all this. And then at the end, we get to see his own pain, right? And his own challenges, and the fact that there's something about it that he's being drawn to, that it's also part of that pain. So when I say that trauma reshapes how I see myself, how I see others, and how I see myself in the world, it's present even in the smallest fibers of what we notice. And sometimes we see people on the surface, they appeal to be successful, connected, well-adjusted people, but we don't know what's behind it, right? We don't know what the pain is. Because at the end, this is a quote by Stephen Porges, who is the person who created the concept and a lot of the theory of the polybagel theory. And in the training, we're going to go in depth, a little more in depth in terms of understanding the polybagel theory and how that plays a big role in healing and understanding trauma. But he has a quote that I really connect, and I really do think that it really simplifies our understanding of trauma. And as a Gestalt therapist, it really resonates for me that trauma, it's a chronic disruption of connectiveness. That's what it is at the end of the day. It's a disruption of our ability to be in contact, not just with others, but with ourselves. We disconnect in order to survive. And that's the ultimate consequence of trauma, right? It's this very painful experience that the way we survive it is by disconnecting. So trauma is not what happens to you. It's not the event. It's not the situation. Because that is not enough of understanding, right? And that doesn't justify it. It's not, there could be multiple people that experience the same event and they come up with it in a different way. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that it's very unfair to judge my past experiences from the eyes of the present, because I could always minimize, change, compare, contrast, which is not true, because trauma is about what happens inside, is the impact that it has in my ability to function and see myself, right? In my ability to connect with others. And it's this sense that being in that pain is the worst thing that could happen. So when we're working with people who experience trauma, we have to be careful, because sometimes in doing this work, and us Gestalt therapists do a lot of work with emotions and body and this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of the times when people have experienced trauma, there is nothing more threatening than to be in their body, because they have worked for years, and sometimes 10, 20, 30 years to avoid being in their body, right? To do the opposite of that, being in that experience. So this is something that I think is really important. And I want you to just take a moment and be mindful of this, right? And think about this for a moment. So the invitation of therapy especially when it comes to what I'm talking about in terms of recovery and all these things. So think about this for a moment. You have been doing for years this behavior, this substance, this way of adapting in the world that is dysfunctional. It's created problems for you, obviously, no consequences, all these things. However, this is how you have survived. This has been your best friend, your best way of adapting to the world and not experiences this tremendous amount of pain and discomfort and unpleasant memories and so on. And suddenly you come to therapy and the invitation is stop doing that thing that has helped you survive. Stop doing that thing that has helped you suppress and put away the pain and not experience all this discomfort that it's so overwhelming that you think you might die. So stop doing that. So then you could make space for all those unpleasant feelings and memories to come to the surface. And you could actually, after years and years of doing this tremendous effort to not feel, you could just feel all of that because eventually you're going to feel better. It's a horrible invitation, right? It's not the greatest invitation in the world. If you think about it, it's quite threatening. However, right? And I believe this, and I think most of you do, we have hope that this invitation is worth it because we believe in healing. We believe in the possibility that if they go through this exploration and this healing, they don't have to be in the prison of addictive behaviors and constant suffering, that they can make space for the pain and heal. But in that moment, in the early invitation, it's a crappy invitation. So it's important for us to be aware that what we are inviting our clients to join us in is not a very attractive invitation. And for them in that moment, they still don't know what hope looks like, what's coming. So it's important to be aware of what we're inviting people to join us in. So we could meet them, we could create support, we could guide, we could manage, right? And not just expect that they're going to be super motivated because of the negative consequences. Because if that was enough, there would be no addiction, right? If the negative consequences was enough to motivate people to stop, we wouldn't have people who are struggling for years with destructive behaviors. So I want to talk a little bit more about trauma to help us understand how the impact that it has and how it's present and what we're talking about in a little bit of a deeper way. So one of the ways that that helps us understand addiction is to see how it affects our ability to be in the moment and be human, et cetera, et cetera. So there's 4 aspects of trauma, right? The 4 aspects of trauma in terms of how it presents in adulthood. Not necessarily adulthood, it could be in adolescence as well, but how it's manifested. And the more time passes, the more we are able to see these consequences. So number 1, there's a loss of response flexibility. In Gestalt, we call this a fixed Gestalt. So I see the world to the very narrow focus of what is safe and what is not. The world becomes very black and white. There's not ability to just be flexible in my response. If something feels uncomfortable, if something's a possible threat, I run. You see this happening in the video with the young lady who is beginning to get close to this guy, and then there's a moment of this possibility, this small possibility of hurt, and in that moment there's a fixed response, right? I'm not able to be flexible. I have to leave and protect myself. So one of the ways that trauma is present and one of the impacts that it has, it does not allow us to adjust to the world in a flexible way because it has to be safe, and in order for it to be safe, it's very rigid. The other aspect is that there's a fundamental disconnect from the self. So I cannot fully be able to see my authentic self, to be in the sense of who I am, because that is buried deep in pain. And in order to be able to have a sense of connection, there's a sense that I'm going to connect with uncomfortable memories, experiences, emotions, and feelings. So I have to remain fundamentally disconnected from a part of me. in order to survive, in order to adjust in the world, there's certain things of me that I just simply cannot see. The consequence of that is that I'm missing some of the essence of my humanity and my connectiveness and some pleasant parts of me, because they cannot be seen because they're too close to the pain. It shapes the view of the world. This is what I was referring to earlier, right? When I experience trauma and pain, I see the world through the lens of the trauma, because that's the only way that I'm able to relate. So not only does it get in the way of being flexible and the ability to see myself, it also affects how I see the world around me. And consciously, this is related to the polyvagal theory. Our autonomic nervous system is in charge of what keeps us alive, basically breathing, blood pressure regulation, and so on. But one of the things that our autonomic nervous system also does is that it's constantly looking for possible threats in the environment, in our internal world, and in the relationship between. Stephen Porges calls this neuroception, which is awareness without consciousness. So we're constantly, without being aware that we are, looking for threats in the environment, right? Consciousness without awareness, I think is the term. But more relevant is the fact that is this constant state of alert, protectiveness, but it's not something that we are aware that we're doing. We're doing it automatically in order to stay safe. And we react to it without even knowing that we are. Because once again, when something is linked to our survival, we are constantly reacting to that. And there's no time to think. One of the examples that you find in some of the literature that I find very enlightening is an example of a young man who goes to war, right? And he comes back. He's now settled in and he's trying to live his life, and he is walking around after a fun day. He went out with his girlfriend and they had a good time. They're in the parking lot, and then a car backfires. As soon as he hears an explosion, he's on the floor and he's back in the trenches of the war. And it takes him about 20 minutes to realize that he's not in whatever war, that he's in a parking lot in a safe place. And when you explore this with this person, there is at one moment when he was in the trenches, if you heard anything that sounded like a gunshot and you were not immediately in the floor, there was a high chance you were going to die because you didn't get out of the way soon enough. So it's stored in the autonomic nervous system that if you hear something that sounds like a gunshot, you don't have time to figure out if it's a gunshot or not. You have to react, be on the floor, and protect yourself, because if not, you're dead. So trauma shapes how I see the world and how I react to it. Even beyond consciousness, I'm constantly protecting myself. Which leads to the fourth element here, which is the impossibility to be in the present moment, which for me is one of the most deepest impacts of trauma, right? In that example, he's back in the war. That's what shapes, our eyes are shaped by trauma. It's really hard to see the world from our present moment. We see it from versions of the past, from the hurt child, from the angry adolescent, from all those different parts that are back there, right? I know I have definitely experienced moments where I'm a full-blown adult, but there's moments there I feel like a little child, that I don't have the words to express myself or say what I need. That's what trauma is. The inability to be in the present, and you continue to see the world through the lens of the past. So it doesn't allow us to see that now I'm grown up and I can protect myself, that I could do something different, that I could relate to others from a place of power, not from a place of strength and suppressing emotions and just pushing through and not feeling. That's ultimately one of the worst consequences of trauma, that we are unable to fully ever be present and fully be able to connect with others. So an important concept. And in the training, we will go into much more depthness about some of these concepts and some of these ideas. And as I mentioned before, more about the polyvagal theory and understanding the nervous system and how it relates to addiction and trauma. One of the things that I talk about is the basic human needs. And in the training, I go into depthness about what those are. But then at one point, we summarize it to the two basic human needs that every child needs. And I want to emphasize that I'm using the word need, not want, not ideal. And every child, because it's true, every human being deserves two things at the bare minimum: to be able to be authentic, which means expressing my emotions, my sensations, my ideas, my thoughts, my interests in an environment that is safe and loving and supportive, that I could actually be allowed to be that authentic self. Not real self, not ideal self, to make mistakes, to have sadness, to have anger, to have joy, to have interest, to have creativity, to have all those things that are natural to every child, and to be able to express them. The other need is to attach, right? And the need to attach is linked to survival. There's one thing that every child intrinsically knows: that we cannot take care of ourselves on our own. We need the adults. Ideally, parents, but any adult will do when we're very vulnerable and young, because we know that we cannot feed ourselves, protect ourselves, clothe ourselves, etc. So I need to attach to this adult, hopefully in a loving attachment, hopefully in an attachment what I'm seeing. But that is a need that trumps every other need, because it's once again directly linked to me surviving, literally surviving. So what happens often is that need to be authentic, it's trumped by the need to attach. So to make it simpler, right? So we have a child that is growing up in this environment, and this child is very excitable and energetic and creative and adventurous, and likes getting into the mud and doing all these things and exploring and very excited about the world. And mom says, little girls don't behave that way. You have to be proper, you have to be clean, you have to wear dresses, you have to be nice, you don't play in the mud, you're not loud, you don't yell, you have to be quiet. There's a message that the little girl is getting. In order to be loved and seen by my mom, in order to be accepted and protected and attached, I cannot be me. I have to be this other person that is a good little girl and proper. There's some little girls that are able to fully adjust to being that person and fully suppress who they are. And there's anything between in that continuum to not being and constantly feeling that I'm letting people down and not being good enough. At the end of the day, to whatever degree that happens, that need to attach will constantly trump the need to be authentic. So I grew up having beliefs about who I am being not okay, being wrong. This is what shame is. The essence of shame is I am not okay. I am wrong. So it creates all these beliefs about not good enough, not smart enough, not lovable, not capable, whatever it might be. So I shape and I change, and I do this to attach. When we're young, this is the best thing that we could do. Once again, our nervous system does whatever it needs to do to survive, organismic self-realization. So if what I need to do is be a proper little girl and don't play in the mud for this person to love and protect me, I will become that. But that has a consequence, right? It starts to create a concept of shame of who I am and needing to be someone who is not me in order to be loved, right? You project this into the future, you could see how disruptive this could be. And it creates a disconnect with my body, with my emotions, with others in the world. Because the only way that we're able to be connected, to be present, to interact with others, to experience the range of my emotions is by being allowed to be my authentic self, for being allowed to see that those feelings, thoughts, interests are beautiful, are perfectly imperfect. It's part of being human. And until there's a possibility for me to be a compassionate human, it's really, really hard for me to connect with others. This is tremendously uncomfortable. And this is where addiction comes into play. As I mentioned before, the ultimate creative adjustment, the ultimate way of adjusting and adapting to the world, and continue to suppress my authentic self and continue to be able to function in this horrible disconnect from the world, is if I just do something that pulls me away so I don't feel it, so I don't sense it, so I don't experience it. So the relationship with trauma and addiction becomes a way of living and adapting. So one of the ways that helps me understand is this diagram, right? Where on the green side, there's all the pleasurable behaviors, substances, sex, working, eating, shopping, whatever. By themselves, as I mentioned before, doing something that feels good is not an addiction yet, right? And potentially ever. So by themselves, pleasurable behaviors are not a problem. The blue side is trauma, unprocessed emotion, broken attachment, etc., human pain and discomfort. That's part of all of us, right? There's no one that goes through this world that does not experience this type of traumatic event. So them by themselves, once again, human pain and discomfort and broken situations, they're not a problem. They're part of being human. What happens is that eventually I grow up in this place where I cannot express certain things. I cannot fully be myself. I'm shameful. I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable, and all these things. It becomes a very uncomfortable way of being. And then we do these things that feel good, I have a drink and it makes everything go away. I get really good grades and suddenly the pain goes away. And eventually they begin to come closer together. And there's a period of that functional creative adjustment that I talked about before, where it still has not become a disruptive addictive behavior. It just feels good and makes things go away. And I'm able to be whatever, a better student, a better son, a better suppressor of my authentic self. So for all intended purposes, it's allowing me to survive that moment in time, right? It's allowing me to find a place that I belong or feel connected, even though it's based on not really being my authentic self. In the moment, it allows me to survive. But if this continues, they become so linked and so intertwined. And that's what we call compulsive addictive behaviors, right? The belief that if I stop doing this thing that feels good, the pain of that trauma, of that horrible situation will be so unbearable that I will not be able to survive it. That's how those two become linked. And they're constantly interchanging in this constant feedback loop, that the only way I feel better is when I do this thing that feels good. And otherwise, I'm in this unbearable human experience that I will never survive. So when we talk about what we're doing, right, what the purpose of this is, we need to know that, yes, part of the goal is to recover, right? To recover, and a lot of times in recovery, we think about that means stopping the behavior or the use. But the word recover, right? If we pay attention to what the word is getting something back that was lost. That's what recovery is about. It's about getting those things that we lost along the way. And the most important thing that we lost along the way is our ability to connect with me, right? And my ability to be present and be in connectiveness with myself and therefore with others. So our goal when we're doing this work, when we're working in recovery, it is to recover, but it's also to reconnect. Because at the end, addiction is the disruption of connectiveness, right? You probably heard this around, it's been a buzz thing around the recovery world, that the cure for addiction is not abstinence, it's connection, right? Yes, but in order to connect, in order to be able to hold enough of me to be able to let in some of you, there's a lot of healing that needs to happen. There's a lot of work that needs to happen prior to that. Because without that, we can't fully be present with others. So I want to talk about us, the therapists. You sitting here with me, you listening to me talk for a moment. But there's a role that is very important. And this is something that I talk a lot more in depth in the training, because I really do believe that there's three elements that we bring as a therapist in the room that are our responsibility to be aware of, because it really does make a difference, right? Because we're there with an intent to provide a space for healing. So what does that look like, right? What is our role as a therapist? And I think that there's three components to that. Number one, our role is to provide safety. I want to take a brief moment and explain something here, right? When we say safety, safety is not the absence of threat. Safety is the ability to make contact. So when I'm talking about safety, I'm talking about a space that takes a time to build. Space when the person can be able to be in permanent contact, not permanent, permanence, and be able to have somebody that they see and they're seen by. This is a very important part. One of the things that most human beings are starving for, especially the ones that are in this severe pain that we're talking about now, is to be seen, to be acknowledged, for their reality to be seen, not changed, not invalidated, not bettered. The first thing that they need to be seen. And in that being seen, we begin to create a safe environment, right? That we're in a place where you can be in contact with another human being without having the expectation that you need to be different, right? Without having somebody that is going to reprimand you because you made mistakes. You could learn from that. We could talk about them. We could explore them together. So part of our role as a therapist and our responsibility is that we're the holders of safe. We're the holders of safety, sorry. The next one is contact, right? When we talk about contact, is this ability to be present with the other and have a part of me be shared with the other, so I could take in the other, so I could take the parts of the other. We are not going to be able to expect, there are clients when they're starting especially, are going to have the ability to hold a space for contact. That is the role of us, the clinicians. It's our job to create space for contact. Now, I believe that there's a prerequisite for this. So in order for me to hold space for contact, I really believe that I need to allow myself to have some vulnerability. My biggest challenge as a clinician is to allow myself to be vulnerable with the other, because that vulnerability creates openness, creates the ability to contact and relate. Now, it's impossible to hold vulnerability all the time, and I'm not saying that, right? But as best I can, to be fully present and open and willing to be a human that is vulnerable with the other, and I could experience you, and I could be in contact with my emotional experience of you when I'm being triggered, and be able to hold that space for both of us. That is important, and it's a requirement in order to have healing. Finally, hope. This is something that I'm personally very passionate about, because I think that this is not hope in terms of this optimism that things are going to be okay, everything's going to be fine. That is not hope, right? That is just this false sense of security. Hope is the ability to hold space, knowing that healing is possible, knowing that there's a possibility, even though it's a long road and it could be painful, that this person will eventually be able to have a space of healing, connectiveness, that they could develop a relationship with their authentic self. And it's hope that comes in micro doses. Is those small moments, those small glimmers of connectiveness, of peace, of possibilities, of being able to see beyond who I think I am, and there's no other option. This is who I am, and this is going to be forever, and this is my narrow reality. and that begins to expand little by little. So when I'm talking about holding hope, I think that that's the hardest job and the hardest part of our work, because it's not always easy, right? There's plenty of moments where I experience hopelessness. There's plenty of moments where I experience something that's so challenging and hard that I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. But coming back to it and knowing that there's a part within us and all of us where we could hold on to that hope. We could hold on to the possibilities that humans can heal, that humans can support each other in a loving way. And for me, I see as my responsibility to be the holder of hope, especially when the other cannot. And there's plenty of times where our clients cannot hold hope. They will not be able to for a while. So I get to hold it for both of us. And that's important, right? So inside of all of us, there's a sense of where we have that possibility of hope. Once again, not this blind optimism, but the sense that the work that we do provides a space of healing, that this human can emerge and be able to live a life that feels more fulfilling and connected. Yes, there will be pain. Yes, there will be discomfort, but there's a difference between being able to have those experiences when I know that I'm present in this moment and I don't need to run away from myself all the time. I need to run away sometimes, right? We need to make space for disconnecting. But that I could hold the space, that it's safe, that I could be as best as I can in contact with the other and hold on to the hope that this journey, as scary, as uncomfortable, as potentially unpleasant as it can be, that is worth it in the long term. That I know that there's a possibility where healing can happen. And that for me is really important. And sometimes I think that's the biggest thing that we bring to the therapeutic relationship, our ability to do this, because we know there's a possibility for healing to happen, that we could hold that space for the other. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, these are some of the ideas of what we're going to be covering, some of the basic concepts as a brief introduction. If you are interested in finding out more, I will include a link to the program in the description of this video, as well as a way of contacting me if you have any questions. I'm going to share briefly the content of the training. And as I mentioned before, it's a 6-module training. We meet every other week for 3 hours. All of the modules are recorded. So if for any reason you missed part of it, or you're not able to be there in one of the modules, you'll have the ability to watch it later. And for anybody that participates in the training, you will have access for those videos. So it's something you could always revisit later. So here on the screen, you could see all the 6 modules and different topics we're going to cover. We're going to go through some of the things that I talked about today in more depthness in terms of understanding trauma and addiction, a lot more of the Gestalt perspective on that. We're going to talk a lot more about understanding the nervous system and then place in this. And a big part of this that I didn't talk about it so much today, but one of the big components of doing this work is that there's a period where what we're doing is creating support and resources. So a lot of the times when we're working with people in this early process, before we even do anything, any conversations, any exploring of the pain and the healing, the possible trauma work, we're working with creating enough resources, enough of the ability to sit in the room with discomfort before we even address the story. So trauma work is not the same as trauma processing. Trauma work begins the day they sit with us and we begin to build a relationship and we begin to hold that contact, that safety, and that hope. Trauma work comes later when there's a space where there's a possibility for healing and beginning to address some of that pain and some of those stories. So it's important to know those are 2 different things. And later in the module, we'll talk about this compassionate relational trauma model, which is the model that I've been developing and working through the years, and it's coming to this this way of working within the Gestalt relational approach and highlighting, because I think compassion has always been part of Gestalt work, but highlighting the role of compassion in doing that trauma processing and how to do that work. As we'll talk about group work and family work and all these other components and working with a larger system. But the idea is that it gives you an opportunity to have a framework of understanding this work and what are some ways to begin to provide those space for healing and processing. Part of the modules is going to be lecture. We're going to do some exercises and then some demonstrations of the work. So there'll be a couple moments along the way where I work with a volunteer and just demonstrate how this work looks like. So I hope that this has been a useful investment of your time. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. For those of you that were here live, to take time out of your day to sit here and listen and be with me. If you have any questions, if you're interested in the program, or even if you just want to reach out and connect and have a conversation with me, please feel free to do so. I love talking about trauma. This is a passion for me to bring awareness. And I love connecting with clinicians all over the world and hearing about you and your work. So if you're interested in the training, please join us. But please know that you can contact me even if you're not, if you want to have a conversation with me about the work that we're doing and the work that you are doing as well. So I want to leave you with one more poem from the client, and this is later on in his process. And for me, just as I said in the beginning, his poem helps us understand why this work is important. And for me, this poem tells me why this is so valuable and how beautiful the work that we do is and the possibilities of what happens if we just hold on to that connection and that hope. Hopeful. At times, it seems there's nothing but darkness. There's no hope, so we drink and turn to drugs. A way to cope and numb our pain. But what do we gain? We grow to be insane. But it's not too late to repair the damage, to heal our wounds. We can find the light within each of us. There is good in every one of us. It may be difficult to find that light, especially after living in the dark for however long. I will admit, I'm still trying to find peace myself. Have so much anger, and at times I resist recovery. I want to change, and I believe it's possible. It's even in range. When we find the light and embrace it, it spreads. From our souls to our hearts to our heads. It's never too late to take control of our fate. My greatest enemy whispers in my ear. He's manipulative, deceiving me for years. I'm afraid at times, but it's just a test. Not different than the rest. We all have our battles, internally or otherwise. How you fight yours is up to you. I don't mean to preach. This is more of a reminder to myself. Don't give up. This is why this work is important and meaningful. This is what hope looks like and the possibility and why this journey, I believe, is important. So if you're interested, as I mentioned before, contact me. Be happy to explore possibilities. And I want to say something as well to the rest of the world and anybody that's watching in different areas, because I'm fully aware that everything that's going on in Eastern Europe, everything that's going on in parts of the Middle East and Asia and our African friends. And I want to make sure that if anybody's interested in this program, please reach out to me. Don't let the cost of it be something that hurts you away from connecting with me and learning. my goal is to connect, to share some thoughts and ideas, to hopefully support you in supporting others in this healing process. So anybody that's interested in joining the program, please contact me. And if for any reason there's a financial concern about it, please don't let that get in the way of you being in this journey with us. So I hope this was something that was a benefit to all of you. I appreciate you once again for taking your time to sit here with me. And for those that will watch this video later on, I hope that I'll get to connect with you in one point. And please enjoy the rest of your day.